Good morning. Welcome to our continuation of Constitution Day celebration. I'm glad to see you all found the room. I know we were all wondering about the Fertilizer Institute. And I did note, I'm sure you did as well, that it's not just any convention, it is the World Convention of Fertilizer. And we all know that that's appropriate that it be held in Washington, D.C., where one can always find lots of shiitake mushrooms. We have two great panels this morning, both built around speakers who are at Hillsdale College and have written great books. And our first panel this morning will be moderated by Ronald Pistrito. Dr. Pistrito is Dean of the Graduate School of Statesmanship at Hillsdale College, where he holds the Charles and Lucia Shipley Chair in American Constitution. He serves as a senior fellow at the Kirby Center here in Washington, and is also a senior fellow at the Claremont Institute. He earns BA at Claremont McKenna College and his MA and PhD at the Claremont Graduate School. He's the author of several works, Woodrow Wilson and the Roots of American Liberalism, and he's also the editor of Woodrow Wilson, The Essential Political Writings. Dr. Pistrito.
Thank you, Matt, and thanks to Doug Jeffrey and to Matt for inviting me to be with you this morning. Our first panel will be a discussion of my colleague Tom West's new book titled The Political Theory of the American Founding, Natural Rights, Public Policy, and the Moral Conditions of Freedom. And I've been very much looking forward to this panel for some time, since, of course, Dr. West is one of our own at Hillsdale, and since I really think that his new book is very much destined to become one of the most important scholarly treatments of the founding in our time. In the book, The Political Theory of the American Founding, Tom provides a complete overview of the American founders' political theory. The book is intended as a response to the current scholarly consensus, and that consensus holds that the founders' political thought is best understood as a kind of amalgam or combination of liberalism, republicanism, and other traditions. And Dr. West argues, on the contrary, that the foundational documents of our founding overwhelmingly point to natural rights as the lens through which all of the politics of the founding can be understood. Now, one difficulty with a panel on a new book is that many here may not yet have read it, although I would encourage you all to do so. So what we're going to do is begin with Dr. West himself, and he will give a presentation of the book's argument, and then we'll follow with commentaries from the other panelists. So I'll introduce everyone here in the order that they will be speaking. So we'll begin with Dr. Tom West. He teaches in Hillsdale's Politics Department as the Paul Ermine Potter and Dawn Tibbetts Potter Professor of Politics. And among his many books and articles are an earlier treatment of the founding, which many of you may be familiar with, titled Vindicating the Founders, as well as the widely used Four Texts on Socrates. That has an introduction by Dr. West and translations of Plato by Dr. West and his wife, Hillsdale's own Dr. Grace Starry West. Following Dr. West will be Dr. Patrick Deneen. Dr. Deneen is Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Notre Dame, where he holds the David A. Potenziani Chair of Constitutional Studies. His PhD is from Rutgers University, and his books include The Odyssey of Political Theory, Democratic Faith, Conserving America, and the forthcoming book, Why Liberalism Failed, and that will be published with Yale University Press, I'm told, in January. Concluding our presentations will be Dr. Joshua Mischel. He's Professor of Government at Georgetown University. He's the author of numerous articles in his field and also of 4 books. The most recent of those is Tocqueville in Arabia, Dilemmas in a Democratic Age. And that was published by the University of Chicago Press, and Dr. Mitchell received his PhD from the University of Chicago. So I think we will begin with Dr. Tom West.
Thank you, RJ. I want to say something first about some of the characteristic differences in my approach in this book to what has prevailed in the scholarship that dominates the field so far. First of all, I talk about the founders simply from their own point of view, talk about fundamentally what their documents say and what the principles articulated in their official documents were. So that means I'm not talking about where did the founders get their ideas. Scholars tend to spend lots of time on whether Locke was or was not the evil genius behind the founders, or the hero, as some would say, whether Protestantism, etc. I mean, you can get into these endless discussions of provenance without talking about what the founding actually was. Secondly, I talk about, throughout the book, the consensus of the founding. As much as possible, as I say, rely upon documents approved by elected officials, preferably representative assemblies like town meetings, legislatures, conventions, and so forth. And so I pay very little attention to what was uniquely believed by individual founders, John Adams, Jefferson, Madison, and so forth. In so far as those founders help us understand the big picture, I do quote them, but as illustrative to what the consensus turned out to be. Third, I spend lots of time with documents from individual states because, as it turns out, in the founding, the U.S. Constitution did not attempt to solve the question of government as a whole. All it did was to set up a federal government and allocated almost all domestic policy decisions to state governments. And one of the almost shocking things about my profession, political science, is how few political scientists who teach the founding ever get beyond the founding documents at the federal level. The Federalist Papers, Constitution, Declaration of Independence. Those are truly indispensable, but without knowing what happened in state governments and what they were saying about politics and natural rights and what government needs to do, you will miss out on about 80% or 90% of what the founders thought government needed to do to achieve its proper goal. And then finally, my fourth distinctive aspect in the book is I treat the founders' political thought as if it might be true. 20 years ago, I published Vindicating the Founders, in which I defended the founders, tried to make the case that their argument was right. But in the new book, I neither defend nor criticize. In this book, I'm giving an explanation. In fact, I compare it to an archaeology. Understanding the founding is increasingly, in my experience, like digging up old bones. People don't know anything about it. We hear the slogans, created equal, consent of the governed, but we don't know the way they thought of those things in the context in which they understood them. Now, what I want to do in the next couple of minutes is to say a little bit about what the bulk of my book is about, namely, how did the founders think government should secure our natural rights? That's what the purpose of government is, that, but how? What does the government actually need to do? In the first place, it's foreign policy, which in the founding has two guiding principles, both based on the natural rights, natural law theory of the founders. One is, of course, the government's there to secure your rights by protecting them, protecting you, protecting individual citizens against violence coming from abroad. That's to be done by means of armed forces, diplomacy, alliances, whatever it might take. This mandate in the Constitution's preamble, the common defense, is the sole purpose of foreign policy in the founding. Then the second principle of foreign policy, also articulated early in the Declaration, is the principle that every nation has a right to a separate and equal station in the world. That's the non-intervention principle, or the anti-imperialism principle. What it means is that the United States that the natural law forbids the United States from interfering in the course and affairs of other nations. These two principles, I think it's fair to say, either no longer guide American foreign policy or guide it only in some degree, because other concerns have become to the fore in recent foreign policies, such as solving the problems of other nations. For domestic policy, government's first duty here, as in foreign policy, is to protect citizens against violence or trespassing. And this means especially making and enforcing criminal laws against harm to life, liberty, and property. This is what government is supposed to do. In fact, Jefferson said government would be remiss in its principal purpose were it not to restrain wicked and dissolute men who commit violations on the lives, liberties, and properties of others. That's the basic meaning of securing our rights in the domestic policy arena. In striking contrast with Jefferson is today's government's priorities. Let me give you a few quotes. In 2014, 5 years after the discovery of 11,000 abandoned rape evidence kits in Detroit, only 2,000 of those kits had undergone DNA testing, allowing serial rapists to remain free and in some cases to commit more attacks. Memphis, Tennessee had a backlog of 11,000 untested rape kits, 12,000 in 2014. In Houston, 20,000 burglary, theft, assault, and hit-and-run cases with workable leads were not even investigated in 2013. Texas judges, up until quite recently, have punished first-degree murder commonly with probation and no prison time. These lapses, which are characteristic of governments throughout the states, represent a tacit rejection of the founders' view that the basic way government secures our rights is through enforcement of criminal law and those types of criminal laws. We now have the experience after the 2017 Charlottesville riot of people openly arguing that citizens who have the wrong political opinions do not deserve the equal protection of the laws. They do not deserve to be protected by having criminal prosecutions instituted against those who attack them. In the founding, in addition to the criminal laws of the founding to protect individuals and private associations, government has to implement civil laws of various kinds. For example, on property, contracts, and personal injury. In part 3 of my book on property and economics, I explain how the natural right to acquire and possess property can't be secured without an elaborate legal infrastructure. In the founders' view, it is not enough to get government out of the way. That's a common libertarian opinion of our time, which the founders completely rejected. Property, first of all, has to be defined by government. Deeds have to be recorded so that everyone knows in a legal sense who owns what. There have to be clear legal standards for contracts and reliable enforcement of them in courts of law so that the right to acquire property through trading, through commerce, can be properly protected. There must be a stable supply of money for conducting exchanges on the market, which means government had a responsibility to not inflate the currency. And in the founders' view, government should base its currency on a metallic standard of gold, silver, or both. Lawsuits for personal injury should be provided for so that harms to people that are less than crimes, that are minor but still real harms, can be compensated through the courts of law. And in addition to these two, the criminal law enforcement and civil laws of the type I just mentioned, there's a third kind of law that the founders thought was important, and that is laws to promote the moral foundations of a free government. And I'll quote the Virginia Bill of Rights on that. Quote, "No free government or the blessings of liberty can be preserved except by a firm adherence to justice, moderation, temperance, frugality, and virtue," unquote. The many ways by which government does that in the founding is the theme of, that's the theme of part 2 of my book, which is called The Moral Conditions of Freedom. And these include laws on marriage and divorce. which were designed to promote stable marriages, to make divorce possible but rare. They also outlawed sex outside of marriage, whether heterosexual or homosexual, although, as I discovered, enforcement of those laws was rather lax in practice. And in fact, I never found a single instance in the founding in which a same-sex relationship between adults was punished by criminal law, although it was illegal in every state. Fourth, government has to make some minimal provision for its poor. And that means, and although for most people the protection of the laws, protection of national defense was enough so that they could provide for themselves through their own industry, frugality, and through family relationships, that wasn't always possible. There were problems with orphans, unemployment, disability. And private institutions, although they were preferred, were not always available. So government always believed itself to be the last resort, needed to be present as a last resort to take care of people's problems of that type when they were sufficiently urgent. But they did that in a way very differently from ours. We think the way to do that is to give people specific benefits if they are designated to be sufficiently poor. Their idea was, well, if you're sufficiently poor, we will set up a group home and you can come and live there and you will be required to work insofar as you have the ability to work. The result was very few people were ever on welfare in the history of the 19th century because being in the poorhouse was not a very wonderful thing to be. You typically made efforts to get out of it as quickly as you could, and those who were able-bodied and managed to do so did. So to conclude, I want to quote Yuval Levin, a comment he made on National Review Online. He said, "West begins from the depressing but plausible premise that the thought of the founders must be presented to contemporary Americans as a novelty because it is largely unknown. So he begins at the beginning and offers a compelling case that the doctrine of natural rights, bounded by the moral natural law, was the core of the founders' political theory, and, adds Levin, for reasons that should still speak to us." Thank you.
Well, first I want to thank Hillsdale College for the invitation to speak on Tom West's book and for the opportunity to read this really fine book, and to thank Tom for writing it. I want to raise questions. I think I've been invited here to raise questions about the book, but I want to do so in the context of a deep appreciation of what West has accomplished in this book. It is a really masterful study and analysis of the view, the broad, as he puts it, the founders' consensus, and I learned much from reading the book. But the question I want to raise really goes to the heart of the claim of the book, which is the view that there was a consensus, in some senses, a broad agreement among many different voices at the time of the founding. Now, whenever one wants to reach a consensus, as we know from politics, one often has to smooth some edges. One has to render certain differences less evident. And while West provides a wealth of evidence, and a really stunning wealth of evidence, supporting expressions of support of the natural rights philosophy, at the same time, the book tends to leave aside internal disagreements and debates, even within, but also even outside of the natural rights philosophy, sometimes by the same thinkers. This, as Tom has indicated, leads at times to needing to dismiss particular claims by some of the founding fathers. So Madison, Hamilton, Jefferson at times don't get the natural rights philosophy right. In fact, one of the things I learned was that apparently Zephaniah Smith is the only of the founding fathers, unbeknownst to me, who seems to get everything right.
Theophilus Parsons, too.
Theophilus Parsons. So these are our actual founding fathers. They belong on our currency. The effort then to form this consensus leads to certain elisions and the glossing of challenges within even this generation to the natural rights philosophy. Not, as is often posed by West in the book, from many contemporary scholars, and I represent perhaps one of those, but from the contemporaries at the time of the founding, and even some of the people
who West cites as having supported, as having given evidence of supporting the natural rights philosophy of the founders. He omits, for example, challenges to the basis of the natural rights philosophy itself, voices from the founding period that opposed, for example, the state of nature scenario, so essential to the natural rights philosophy, as a false understanding of human nature, as presenting a false view of human nature, that our nature, in our natural condition, we have to imagine ourselves in a kind of pre-political condition in which, in a sense, everything is defined by our rights. One such voice who is invoked by West in one part of the book to support a view of natural rights philosophy was Nathaniel Niles, not very well known, member of the founding generation, but among other things, the author of a set of sermons, an extraordinary set of sermons, at the time of the, just before the Revolution, 1774, in which he criticizes premises of the natural rights philosophy. In the 1774 sermon, at the time of a rising invocation of the philosophy of John Locke as a justification of the Revolution, he writes in that sermon, or spoke in that sermon, quote, "Originally there were no private interests." He says, to the extent that there was a compact, a first compact that was made to secure or advance private interests, that compact, he says, was made in usurpation. He calls in this sermon to subsuming private interest to the common good, which is a characteristic call of many in kind of the congregational tradition at the time of the founding, echoing the thoughts and words of John Winthrop. He has a line in which he says that each person is only to enjoy his property at the will of the community, which is to be regulated by the interest of the whole. This is somebody who, again, is cited by West as a supporter of the natural rights, but one has to leave out a great deal in order to reach that conclusion. And this is a characteristic expression of some during this period, but more broadly a characteristic expression of a hesitation about a full-throated embrace of the natural rights philosophy and its implications. Now, such strong and explicit criticisms of the natural right philosophy were relatively rare, but not absent. But the suspicion in particular toward the privatistic and corrupting tendencies of the natural rights philosophy was a common theme, and especially in response to the Constitution as it was proposed following the Constitutional Convention. It was especially a concern prevalent among many of the so-called anti-federalists, many of whom are cited again by West when statements can be found of theirs supporting the natural rights philosophy, but otherwise those criticisms are left silent. Such authors, such anti-federalist critics of the Constitution frequently articulated concerns that the Constitution, its fundamental, deeper philosophy, once actuated and over time unfolding, would undermine both civic and personal virtue. And so while many of these authors used the lexicon of the natural rights philosophy, in their view, virtue and morality was not understood as serving the natural rights, our private concerns. Rather, Republican government was emphasized as a discipline of self-rule and itself as serving of morality. In this sense, we can say that for the anti-federalists, in many cases, happiness was not a matter of personal choice, but rather reflected a condition, a kind of objective condition, closer to Aristotelian understanding of eudaimonia, or flourishing. These authors warned that the emphasis, especially upon the private aspects of the natural right philosophy, particularly the emphasis upon personal liberty, private property rights, and the freedom to dispose of those private rights, not only inhering in the property we own, but in ourselves, that this would have the tendency over time of undermining civic and personal virtue. Among the things argued by many of these authors, again, some of whom are invoked by West as reflecting support of this consensus, favored more constraints, for example, on markets, especially out of a concern for what they thought would be the rise of luxury, the development of a disposition to desire material goods and even desire prosperity that would lead to attendant losses of liberty, political liberty, the submission to economic powers, maybe even bowing to foreign potentates, and the personal loss of virtue, which in the form of slavish desires, what we might today call consumerism. That is to say, there was an extensive contemporary awareness that the natural rights philosophy, if left unchecked, would tend over time toward the corruption of morals. And the same kind of concerns were expressed as well about the political organization itself of the Constitution, the tendency to centralize power, the tendency of representatives and representation in Washington to become more distant from the people, the tendency over time to identify more with the national interest as opposed to those local state interests. All of these concerns were expressed at the time of the American founding, not by scholars, not only by some scholars today, but by the contemporaries, in many cases those invoked by West. These critiques and concerns have remained a constant throughout American history. They are as much a part of our founding as our founding, even if they've often been submerged. Concerns during the Jacksonian period, the rise of an agrarian set of interests in America, the populist uprising, and today evinced in such movements as the Tea Party, and even perhaps in the electorate that elected Donald Trump. It's seen today in the misgivings over globalization, and the concerns today over whether or not globalization undermines an important form of self-rule reflects a kind of division today that persists that we see at the time of the American founding, whether certain virtues could be cultivated if economic concerns and interests took the foremost. West's elisions and certain silences contributes to a smoothing that results in an apparently seamless relationship of morality and the natural rights philosophy that is reflected in the inclusion of part 2 that he mentions of his book, The Moral Condition of Freedom. And I think this is really an extraordinary piece of writing, a very learned piece of writing, and I think the most intriguing and original part of the book, spending a lot of time looking at the policies and concerns in the moral realm at the period of the Founding Fathers. And yet I think this part of the book is least convincing in connecting the fundamental philosophical commitments of the natural rights philosophy and the promotion of morality that existed at the time. Throughout the section, West argues that morality was promoted or understood to be supporting the natural rights philosophy, ourselves as rights-bearing individuals, that it provides, as he often states, the rights infrastructure that makes possible the success of a natural rights republic. In other words, being proposed is that morality in some ways is a means for us to secure liberty. And often in this section, religion is framed as also being useful to the securing of public order and morality, which also supports a natural rights republic. But by making morality and the kind of life that it presumes a means, this suggests that this particular condition is, or at least could be, subject to revision if we perceive an alteration in the means of securing our ends of personal liberty. For example, an example that West gives us is that marriage is supported at the time of the founding as needing support because, as he states, it was considered an important component of human happiness, if not for everyone, then certainly for the great majority. Considered a component of human happiness. But what if with changes in our economic lives, our views of relationships, etc., marriage fades as a vehicle that promotes our happiness? If people increasingly conclude that marriage is a limitation upon their liberty, if having children is a limitation upon their personality, if owning and using and disposing of property as one wishes, a central aspect of the natural rights philosophy and includes our own self, we own ourselves, if that disposing of our property leads us to conclude that I don't see my life as bound up with the life of someone else and the propagation of future generations. Can the natural rights philosophy answer the question and indeed propose and even insist that you should get married and that you should have children if the ownership and possession and disposal of our property ourselves leads us to conclude that that's not what we want? In this section of the book, again, a very compelling and striking section, West seems to confuse what I would regard as the dominant set of cultural norms that arose in a condition arose from a set of beliefs and practices before the institution of the natural rights philosophy, largely from a Christian way of life and Christian beliefs, and assumes that those practices and beliefs would continue in a seamless relationship with the natural rights philosophy, that it would do so then and that it would continue to do so now. And I think questions were raised about whether that would be the case then, and those questions, it seems to me, are all the more pressing now. Those two understandings that inherited that older Christian tradition and the newer natural rights tradition seemed compatible as long as people's horizons were not defined most fundamentally by the natural rights philosophy. That the restraint of our rights or our understanding of ourselves as right-bearing creatures had to come from a source outside of the natural rights philosophy. And to the extent that we increasingly defined ourselves as rights-bearing creatures, a kind of solvent was acted upon those practices and beliefs that lead in many predictable ways to our situation today. Now, Tom West and I might differ on our analysis of the hopefulness that the Constitution and its order might give to us, but I think we differ almost not at all on many of our views about the nature of our contemporary world today. And so the question in many ways is what is to be done? John Adams wrote that, and quoted by Tom West, "Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people." Can we conclude today that this Constitution was made for our people today? Are we a moral and religious people? However we got to this point, is the natural rights philosophy a viable philosophy for a people that are arguably perhaps not anymore as a whole, as a large proportion, a moral and religious people, and decreasingly so if studies are to be trusted? West suggests at the end of his book that one can compare the natural rights philosophy of our founders to the Republic of Plato, that these two seem to offer options. And as I read that, I was struck that maybe the comparison was not inapt because both seem highly unlikely as being plausibly realized in today's society. So the question, it seems to me, is that having presented us with this perhaps ideal theory that no longer seems to apply to our contemporary lives and the world, and especially the people to whom it is supposed to apply, perhaps Tom West and I can agree a second volume is needed. What can we do to make a people worthy of a constitution such as this?
Good morning. I, too, want to thank Hillsdale for inviting me. Before I say something about Tom West's wonderful book, let me start by noting the dramatic setting of the last several generations of scholarship in the academic world. There's a massive amount of literature going back 40 or 50 years criticizing the liberal individual and offering various correctives. This is a train that has been ridden to tenure by two generations of scholars. So the alternatives to this liberal individual are the ancient man of virtue, and so a lot of Aristotle scholarship falls into this category. There's the medieval man who's concerned with the common good, and this is Aquinas, who is, of course, has some relationship to Aristotle. You have on the left, you have this unalienated social being of Marx who comes after capitalism is finally destroyed. And so on the left, you get this criticism as well of the so-called liberal individual. And we should note, of course, that because Marx never really had any purchase in America, as Lewis Hartz told us in 1955, the left's version of this Marxism is much more watered down. It takes a village, you didn't build that, this sort of thing. And then you also have the communitarian man of any number of scholars of the last several generations who've tried to say that we can't have this thin liberal self, we have to have a thick and embodied self. And scholarship about the American founding has not escaped these dramatic oppositions. And so were the founders liberals, these individualist liberals, who built on Locke, an earlier liberal? And are they both fatally flawed because they have no substantive vision of man? Was liberalism of the founders partially corrected by this Republican understanding that's interwoven into this liberal view, which saves the founders from the full development of this liberal individualism? And I think Professor Deneen is in some way raising this question, and I want to follow up on this toward the end. But Professor West's book, The Political Theory of the American Founding, refuses to take this bait, so to speak, and finds in the founders a comprehensive and rich understanding of man and of the politics that makes him flourish. Natural rights theory is not an eviscerated liberal theory with no substantive understanding of the institutions and arrangements necessary for man to thrive. It's not a theory that requires republicanism as a corrective in order for the American regime to work well. And so the virtue of the book is it discloses the philosophical coherence of the natural rights and the law of nature. And more importantly, it goes further by showing in rich detail what the moral and economic arrangements were at the time of the founding and why they were connected to the philosophy of natural rights. But therein, I think, lies the difficulty of this wonderful book for us. The founders may not have been disembodied liberal souls of the sort that Americans seem increasingly to be, but retrieving them today for us is difficult in proportion to whether they had the substantive understanding of man that the political theory of the American founding suggests that they did. Hence the difficulty. If the founders were disembodied liberals like us, it would be plausible to easily set the American Republic on its foundation again. If the founders were not disembodied liberals like we are today, the task ahead is way more difficult. So with the understanding that I want to live in the world that the political theory of the American founding sets forth, let me turn to some observations from Tocqueville in the 1830s, which provides an understanding of the profound difficulty of the task. So from Tocqueville, I'm going to identify three distinct problems that emerge, which I think speak to us today. First, what could be called men without history. Natural rights theory presumes that we can envision an original condition constituted by God out of which we come and produce a government. But what if democratic conditions, as Tocqueville calls them, which occur because we break the links between man, between man and history, and between man and nature, produce a kind of soul that has no history, no future, no past, a soul that only lives in the moment and so can't even conceptualize the whole idea behind natural rights theory. In Democracy in America, in Volume 2, Part 2, Chapter 17, Tocqueville says the following: when once these democratic souls have grown accustomed not to think about what will happen after their life ends, they easily fall back into a complete and brutish indifference about the future and the past. As soon as they have lost the way of relying chiefly on distant hopes, they are naturally led to want to satisfy their least desires at once, and it would soon seem that as soon as they despair of living forever, they are inclined to act as if they will not live for one more day. Now, anyone who knows the 20th century political theorist John Rawls will recognize this, because what Rawls, who is the great political theorist wholly endorsed by the left, starts with is a theory according to which human beings have no history. And I think we have to raise the question, does Rawls' theory comport with this new sort of democratic soul that Tocqueville saw emerging already in the 1830s? A person who lives in the instantaneous now. Are we all Rawlsians now who are consumed by this ahistorical need for fairness? And I think on the left, that's where we are. The first problem is men without history. The second problem is what I call the unity problem. In Volume 2, Part 1, Chapter 7 of Democracy in America, Tocqueville says the following: as conditions become more equal, each individual becomes less like his fellows, more like his fellows, weaker and smaller, and the habit grows of ceasing to think about citizens and considering only the people, the folks, if you want to use that language from recent politics. Individuals are forgotten, and the species alone counts. At such time, the human mind seeks to embrace a multitude of different objects at once and is constantly striving to link up a variety of consequences with a single cause, the concept of unity becomes an obsession, the desperate search for uniform rules, if you will. Let me give three manifestations and suggest that these are fatal. First, what happens to God when everything has to be unified? You no longer have an awesome God. You no longer have an awesome God who's a creator God. Remember, the fundamental distinction that you find in Augustine is between God the creator and the created world. But as you become fixed on unity, that disappears. So therefore, no sin, no repentance, no forgiveness, no divine gifts, no mercy. This points to what I'm going to talk about at the end, which is what I take to be the great crisis of our times, the crisis of identity politics. I'll get to this in a bit. So as we move toward this world where there are no awesome differences between creator and created, one manifestation we get is, Jesus is my friend, the softening of the distinctions between man and God. But next is the one that's upon us right now. The world is Gaia's body, and the ghastly confusion of Christian and post-Christian thought, man must save the planet. Can natural rights even be thought of in such a frame of mind? Second manifestation of the problem of unity, what happens between men and women? The denial of natural differences entirely. Sex becomes gender. The search for a universal translator to overcome the misunderstandings that men and women have. And so the book, Men Are From Mars and Women Are From Venus. I take this as a serious, not the book as a serious philosophical act, but the desire to have the universal translator so that we can finally overcome the differences and completely understand one another. Can marriage, a divine ordinance based on these natural differences, even be thought of in such a frame of mind? I doubt it. Third manifestation of the problem of unity, is federalism possible? Is multiplicity within unity even thinkable for a mind consumed by the idea of unity? So with respect to recent political arguments before the Supreme Court decided the matter in different states about gay marriage, it was inconceivable for the democratic soul to think that in Utah they might conclude one thing, in Vermont they might conclude another, and that's okay. And so we have to rush to a uniform understanding. And so federalism is completely at risk if we're incapable of thinking about pluralism within unity. And this, of course, naturally polarizes national politics, and both political parties are more than happy to oblige and take full advantage of this. Is pluralism possible, then, within Tocqueville's democratic age? I'm haunted increasingly by Augustine's remarks in The City of God, Book 19, Chapter 17, where he's trying to suggest that, in fact, the only way that you can have pluralism, if you understand that unity is something that's above the world of time. The city of God is at the end of time, and here in the world below, we have to live with different laws of different nations and accept pluralism. But what Tocqueville's saying is that this fixation on unity makes us really incapable of doing this. This is why diversity is a great sham, because it really does rule out true diversity. It's a false unity. Third, the equality problem, this desperate need for equality. And so we have the shift from IQ, which does separate people, to EQ, which perhaps doesn't, emotional intelligence. We have great inflation. We have too big to fail. We have climate change in order to save the current evolutionary arrangements. We have global management, food security, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. In short, in the age of equality, failure is written out of the equation of human life. Professor West notes, importantly, that the Americans understood that failure was necessary in order to have improvement, hence bankruptcy laws. Go look at the section in the book. It's very important. It's the recognition that failure is inscribed into creation itself, the right to go wrong. So my provocation, from the vantage point of political philosophy, might it be said that the issue of sound money, which is well treated in the book, and Professor West also spoke about it just a few moments ago, is more than just an economic problem. I suspect Professor West agrees. Injections of fiat currency into a failing economy saves the existing order of things. It allows to live those things which should have failed. In evolutionary terms, fiat money currency injections are the equivalent of trying to keep alive the dinosaur ecosystem after the great comet impact of the Yucatan Peninsula some 65 million years ago. The founders set up an arrangement where men had the right to succeed and to fail. Malinvestment has to clear in the democratic age. And if not, are we destined for low growth rates as far as we can see, propped up by never-ending injections of fiat currency, all in an effort to push toward equality to make sure that nobody fails. One more thought that must be hurdled if we are to return to and build upon the world the founders set up: the crisis of guilt in America and in Europe. The founders do not much speak of guilt and sin in their political writings because they presume that this is largely a theological matter, not a political one. For this final obstacle, I have to turn to Nietzsche, whose diagnosis of the crisis of the West is, I think, right on, even if his suggestion for the antidote is completely off. So Nietzsche's wager is the following: the Christian world, the West, is caught in a dangerous intermediary condition between a Christian and a truly post-Christian age. Nietzsche says in The Genealogy of Morals, it's the church and not its poison that offends us, meaning we modern people who think we've escaped from religion. So the West retains the trappings of Christianity: the love of democracy, the love of equality, the idea of rights, sympathy, and guilt, without the overall architecture within which it can make sense. This is the world of identity politics. We have eternal and unpayable guilt presided over by a political party without the possibility of repentance and forgiveness. And on another occasion, because it's not fitting here, I would make extended remarks about how identity politics is a betrayal of Martin Luther King, because what Martin Luther King understood was that while debt and the great wound of slavery, which has very much to do with debt, has a worldly manifestation, in the final analysis, guilt and debt can never be solved through worldly political means alone. It also has to be solved through repentance and forgiveness, which are divine things. And so we've moved into this place where we rejected the Christian architecture, but not the Christian thing called guilt. And this is the crisis of identity politics. And I can assure you, having come back from Europe, where I taught twice this summer, that they are trying out the Nietzschean option, which is, okay, we're going to give up on guilt, we're going to completely forget, and we're going to turn to ethnic nationalism. So this Nietzschean question about what one does with guilt is, I think, a profound question, and we're either going to go beyond it in the way that Nietzsche wanted, or, and I'm, I think, reflecting some of the things that Patrick was saying, we're going to have to return to the larger Christian architecture. So to conclude, my list of obstacles that stand in the way of the return to the founders is relatively short, but they are formidable ones, and if I may submit, will be decided on the battlefield of religion rather than on politics. Thank you.
Thanks to our panelists. In a little bit, we are going to turn to the audience for some questions, but we do have some time first for some exchange among the panelists, and I think I'm going to ask Dr. West to offer just a few minutes of reflection on some of the points raised by the other panelists, and see if we can get some discussion going. Dr. West.
Yes, thanks. I want to thank both the panelists for their very generous comments on the book, and also quite thoughtful concerns and questions that the book raises for each of them. I'll say something first about Joshua Mitchell's remarks on our contemporary situation and how the book might or might not help or help with understand what that is. There were a couple of topics that he mentioned which I think are very much connected to things the founders thought were important in politics, and which I didn't say too much about in my initial remarks. One is God. There's unquestionably a very strong theological dimension to the founding, which we see in the 4 references to God in the Declaration of Independence. Most famously, the state constitutions almost always begin with some sort of reference to divine thanks to God, thanks for divine providence for making this possible for us to create our own governments, not subject to tyranny and despotism. And when Joshua Mitchell, Dr. Mitchell says that God, in the sense of a being who is awesome, who's creative, who presides over and defines sin, repentance, redemption, that God has weakened, if not disappeared. That's true. And certainly in the founding, they thought, insofar as one could speak of God in official documents as part of the founding, that would be the God of nature. But for them, the God of nature was a God of moral authority, not just the so-called clockmaker who sets the clock in motion and walks away, but a being who creates a world of moral rules and expects us to live up to them. This is especially symbolized on the back of the dollar bill in the picture of the eye over the triangle, the eye in the triangle emitting rays. That symbolizes divine providence, and then the words annuit coeptis over it, meaning he approves of what has been started. That's the way the founders thought of God, was a judgmental being, providential and judgmental. He approves or disapproves, and his providence will have an effect on human affairs. Secondly, the men and women distinction, which Mitchell alluded to as crucial. This also goes to a point which I'll get to when I talk about Deneen's comments, but the men and women, yeah, if you can't understand the difference between men and women, between smart and stupid, between virtuous and vicious, if you really want to say we're all equal, and in the sense that those distinctions don't count for anything important, you can't understand the founders. You also can't understand reality. That's not what life is. And Mitchell's right. This desperate need for equality is in the sense of defining away the real differences. Now, let me turn to Deneen's comments. Is there a consensus that one can sensibly talk about in the founding? And Deneen brought up all the ways in which there were disagreements. True. My point was, who won? There are winners and losers in politics. The people who objected lost. I was looking at the winners. The anti-federalists lost. And therefore, I don't care that much about the anti-federalists any longer, except as a historical curiosity, because the Constitution we have was not the one they wanted. Secondly, on the subject of the corrupting influence of the natural rights, that's something everybody in the founding understood. Deneen quoted some anti-federalists. In my book, I quoted John Adams and Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton has a nice quote on that. He says, "Would you tell me how to prevent luxury from producing effeminacy, intoxication, extravagance, vice, and folly?" That's Adams, meaning once you have wealth, you're going to have those consequences. And then Hamilton made the very astute comment, true liberty, by protecting property, tends more powerfully than any other cause to augment the mass of national wealth, which then means, of course, the mischiefs of opulence will follow. Hamilton then says, shall we therefore on this account proscribe liberty? No, he says, 'tis the portion of man assigned to him by the eternal allotment of divine providence that every good he enjoys shall be alloyed with ills except virtue alone. You have to be used to the idea that politics can't solve all human problems. Protecting individual natural rights doesn't mean we're going to not have luxury and wealth. It means we will have it, and then we have a new problem. But you can't have life without good and bad things going together. Third point in Deneen's argument, he wants to say natural rights means self-ownership. Self-ownership means you get to define your own idea of what's going to make you happy. This is the one thing the founders completely disagreed with and denied. For them, natural rights were always within the confines of a moral natural law that put limits on natural rights, including, first of all, you can't harm others, There's a moral meaning to natural law that government has to enforce. And secondly, with regard to marriage, it's the natural law, as the founders understood it, that was supportive of marriage and and it was based on this idea that Mitchell brought up, that there's a difference between men and women. You can't understand marriage if you think men and women go into marriage and that they're going to have the exact same roles. So it's that understanding of the founders' idea of equality was always equal natural rights, meaning the right not to be governed without your consent by other human beings, not that you had the right to define the meaning of your own existence against the will of God and nature.
Okay, thank you, Dr. West. Dr. Deneen or Dr. Mitchell, would you like to respond to that or add anything?
I'm happy to turn it open to the audience.
The audience? Okay, thank you.
Hi, Chris Long. So I guess my question is to quote Alexander Hamilton, to what extent does Professor Deneen suggest prescribing liberty, if he does?
Well, I guess one of the issues at debate is the question of what liberty is, and at least in some of the concerns that were voiced, including in this citation by Alexander Hamilton, who concludes we're going to have to live with these vices and take our chances. And it would seem to me that we have, and maybe we haven't won. But that liberty is not only understood in the freedom to do as one wishes with one's property and oneself, even within the prescribed limits of not harming others, but liberty is a form of self-rule. And in the classical and Christian understanding, one is not free if one simply pursues luxury, for example. One is free when one has the capacity to exercise self-control and self-limitation when it comes, among other things, to the material goods of the world. I think the founders themselves understood, because they were so deeply steeped in the Christian tradition, that this was the form of liberty that they should seek above all, and that no political community could impose this successfully over time if people didn't have this kind of self-direction and self-discipline and self-rule. So it seems to me there was a wager that in the context of a political system that would largely regard this question as out of bounds, that there would continue to be the strength of that Christian tradition that would teach a kind of self-discipline. Again, it seemed to me a wager that was probably thought to be winnable at the time of the American founding. It's not as clear to me from the perspective of some 240 years later that we can draw that conclusion quite as easily. And regardless of what the sources of the corruption were, it's clearly the case that one couldn't hope to impose from above some limitation on liberty, certainly not on a population that would be unwilling to impose those self-impositions on themselves.
I had a professor in law school who once asked, if God gave us natural rights, why doesn't he defend them? My question is, is a belief in natural law necessary for the founders to have devised the Constitution that they did with the accompanying principles?
Well, there's two questions there. One is, why didn't God protect the rights he gave us if he gave us rights? And the second is, do we need natural law in addition to natural rights? So the first question is essentially, why did God create human beings who aren't just born happy and stay happy forever? I mean, Thomas Aquinas has a wonderful answer to that question, which I bet every founder would have agreed with, which is that if we didn't have evil in the world, we wouldn't have anything to do. You wouldn't have virtue. You can't have virtue without vice. You can't have intelligent statesmanship without the possibility of despotic statesmanship. That is, or a quote, one of the quotes the famous quote from Franklin Roosevelt that I mentioned in the book and was mentioned also by one of the discussants. Necessitous men are not free men, says Roosevelt. And the founder's basic response was only through necessities. I mean, I guess I remember this, I remember I quoted a letter of Abigail Adams to her son saying, it's only necessity that brings forth great virtues. That's the only way you can actually perfect yourself as a human being, by facing challenges and difficulties. So, in other words, that's part of the way nature works and the world that God made. As for natural law, the idea of natural law, which tends to be forgotten by many scholars who write about the founding, is that there is a moral meaning to liberty. It's not that you get to do whatever you want, that you don't just own yourself in the sense that you can just do what you like with your life. And when Pat Deneen says that liberty in the older Christian sense meant living according to living in the right way, founders agreed with that. You can't be free unless you're following the proper laws of your own nature, which are not laws of other human beings in the first instance. They're laws that come from God and nature.
Okay. Good morning, sirs. My name is Mateo Moran. Just had a question touching on the topic that you guys have been discussing a little bit this morning about wealth and that relationship with republicanism. I know that both Montesquieu and Hume both say that commerce is an inevitable extension of Republican government and that it is necessary for Republican government, yet one of the issues, obviously, is the corrupting influence of the pursuit of luxury and of avarice to a certain extent. And I think that one of the arguments they make is that eventually this pursuit will lead the people without certain self-control will then be at the subject of being more at the whims of the wills of other men. Would you say that today, as a society, we've reached a point of no return in a regard where we've kind of abdicated that responsibility of having Republican government in the pursuit of luxury and other greater material goods? And have we gotten to the point where we're no longer fit for Republican government in that pursuit, which I believe some of the founders said that it is a possibility down the line if we follow that route?
Well, I'll say something. I don't know if you were directing that to anyone in particular, but I'll say something about it and let others then follow. But the reason why why the people in the founding thought commerce was necessary in a free society is because of the natural right to acquire and possess property. So that natural right is often misunderstood to mean that people who are rich get to stay rich and poor get to stay poor. But what the founders meant by that right was not only the right to keep what you have, but to acquire what you don't have. And that requires commerce. That means you have to have the right and the ability to go out into the market and sell yourself, sell your labor. That's what we do the first time we get a job. We go to a potential employer and say, I can do something that you'll find useful, and if you give me some money, that would be useful to me too. That's freedom. That's what freedom means, and using your own talent then to get what you need in life. You can't have that without a society that allows for commerce. And so now, which then in turn means exactly as I quoted Hamilton saying, eventually that's going to lead to national wealth, which has its own problems, and we have to deal with that. But I had one other thing now that I didn't mention before that was alluded to by Deneen when he gave, by both speakers actually in their remarks, which is a big part of my book, maybe even the biggest section of the book, part 2, is on how government got involved in the idea, in the program of promoting and sustaining the right moral conditions for a free society. That turns out to be much more of a robust, thorough, extensive program than most people today are aware of. That's a part of the founding that is mostly forgotten, partly because it was done by state governments for the most part and not the national. And especially when you get into their marriage laws and how they thought of marriage and what they thought government needed to do. It wasn't enough to just say, oh, it's a Christian thing, it's fine, Christianity will take care of it. No, they thought government. That's a governmental thing because who's going to raise the children? Who's going to protect people when they're old? the family for them was a social and therefore also a political institution to protect people's rights. Who protects the rights of children if parents aren't there to love them and care for them? That's why marriage was supposed to be, why they made it so difficult for there to be divorce. And that was absolutely an integral part. Now, we today say in the name of freedom, we're going to let these kids what? Go to court and then try to track down their, where are they going to get their money from? Go to welfare? Go to the fathers who are no longer at home and therefore no longer have an incentive to give money? Those are the alternatives that that founders saw.
Yeah, the concept that most intrigued me from this discussion this morning was the idea of failure and the rejection of failure. I think politics, science, business is all based on trial and error. And if you refuse to learn from that failure, we're in trouble. And the most recent example of that would be Mrs. Clinton, who completely rejected any responsibility for her failure and consequently will learn nothing from it. So I was interested to hear you discuss that concept of failure.
Could I make a quick observation? So one of the virtues of Tocqueville, if you don't mind, is that he understands that life in the democratic age is never going to be parsimonious. And in this particular case, he understood that in the democratic age, we're going to be pulled in two different directions. On the one hand, we're going to be drawn to equality, and yet precisely because we all have this thing called middle-class anxiety, we're going to desperately need improvement as well. And if you've read your Adam Smith, you know that malinvestment has to clear. There has to be failure. And so what I think Tocqueville sees is that we're going to be torn in these two different directions, and in point of fact, our political cycles might move in this direction or might accord with this oscillation back and forth. So we'll have regimes that think we need to have a little bit of wealth redistribution, and then another, maybe a conservative is going to come along and say, no, we have to get rid of regulation, and we're going to go around and around because in the democratic age there's two goods. There's equality and there's a need for improvement because of middle-class anxiety. While I have the floor, if I can just respond to this commerce observation, but in a slightly different way, I want to talk about the power of money. Tocqueville is hardly a Marxist, but he actually has this insight that money becomes the measure of all things years before Marx has it in early philosophical manuscripts in the Communist Manifesto in 1848. And what Tocqueville argues is that as you move from the aristocratic age to the democratic age, you move from what could be called an economy based on loyalty and obligation to an economy based on money, where every social action has to be animated and lubricated by money. And I think his great concern, and now I come back to my first point about non-parsimoniousness, was, are we going to produce people who are wholly consumed by this fixation on money, or are we going to produce people who understand, and this is perfectly consistent with the theological understanding, that in fact there are different domains of life that don't always overlap. So the question would be the following: do we live in a market, or do we go to a market? This is a fateful distinction, and what Tocqueville worried about was we were going to produce people in the democratic age who were incapable of making distinctions, and so think of everything in terms of money. So long before Marx said this, Tocqueville thought this was going to happen. So yes to commerce, but Tocqueville's worried about the complete fixation about money as we move into the democratic age.
I have a question for Pat. So you've talked a lot about the failures and difficulties with the regime of natural rights. I wonder if you could say a little more about what principles you would have added to the founding, and or what institutions would you have added in substitution for the Constitution, or in addition, that would have somehow perfected the founding and made it what you think it should be? For example, possibly an established religion, an established church.
That's a Tall order. You know, at least the founders got a week or two to create the Constitution. We have like 3 minutes. You know, that's an extremely difficult question. The founders were dealing with pressing questions of their particular time, of their particular era. It seems to me we're dealing with particular questions of our particular era. And so to some extent for me to imagine what could have been done differently that would have led to a different outcome, it's to engage in an interesting theoretical question, but it's one that, to my mind, doesn't apply to our current situation. I don't know the answer. I wish I did to what is to be done now. It seemed to me that the building blocks that the founders had to deal with were a fairly sound society, a fairly sound populace, a populace of some moral vigor and industriousness, the willingness to link guilt, responsibility, forgiveness, a populace that when they took the day off for the Sabbath, took the day off for the Sabbath completely. Do we still have a populace that has those kind of building blocks? If we were to take Tom West's book and say, okay, let's do this right now, do we have the humans, the citizens who are a moral and religious people? Right? Or is this just ideal theory like Plato's Republic now, as far as we're concerned? I guess, to take a very modest, one modest stab at this, and actually here I want to endorse completely at least one aspect of the economic argument of Tom's book. To the previous question about is there a way to think about economics somewhat differently, particularly in a republic? For conservatives, I would really like to encourage those who are concerned with the moral, religious fiber of our nation to think about the ways that our economy does or does not serve that end or purpose. If the economy becomes a kind of autonomous entity, in the way in which Professor Mitchell just described, we're no longer subjecting it to those questions. We're treating it as, in some sense, as separate from those questions. Toward the conclusion of his book, Tom suggests that there are two aspects of the founders' thinking that I would endorse quite strongly. The first of these was to strenuously prevent monopolies. Strenuously prevent monopolies as a thwarting competition as well as forms of concentration of wealth. And it seems to me if we started doing that, it would be a massive improvement of our economy, because we would begin to then encourage certain kinds of competition, certain kinds of failure, right? Monopolies is one way you protect from failure, right? Interestingly, particularly when they're buttressed by the state. The second suggestion is that the founders, and I think this was widely viewed throughout the founding period, that property in some material, real form should be widely owned. Right? The actual experience of owning property and working on property, not in the abstract form, not in the form of stocks and bonds, not in forms of pieces of paper. This is because, as of course Jefferson famously pointed out, to own property is to have a stake in one's society. It's to understand the discipline that comes with the ownership of property. It's one way we discover our mutual actual need for each other is through the ownership and working of our actual property. And if we can think about ways that we can structure our economy, markets are always structured, but structure our economy to achieve these two ends, it would seem to me that would be one way. Maybe it's a limitation on freedom, it's a limitation on monopoly ownership. And it's a form of structuring the market that would encourage widespread ownership of actual real property. I would regard those as beneficial for a Republican society that values self-rule.
Can I add to that one?
We have about a minute left, so just briefly, and then we'll get Dr. Weston.
Go ahead.
Oh, okay, yeah, very quickly. On the economy and the problem of inequality, okay, so how about serious taxes on outsourcing labor? How about serious tariffs on imports from countries that have cheap labor? How about tariff rules that say any country whose regulatory costs are lower than ours then has to pay a higher tariff? I mean, all kinds of ways you could protect American workers and to reestablish some degree of equality in that way in America. Secondly, in regard to the decline of our current world, Teddy's question a minute ago, our world is the way it is, not because of the founding, but because of something else that happened in the last 200 and some years. And I'll give you just one piece of evidence for that, since we're almost out of time, and that is, if you look at the history of Western countries in the 1960s, all of them went through the exact same metamorphosis in almost at the same moment. And so countries, for example, like Germany and Britain, that have long had establishment of religion, official churches, and all the things that the Americans didn't do, all had that exact same thing. There was immediate institution of no-fault divorce throughout the Western world in the 1970s in almost every country. Immediate institution of barriers on employers in terms of their freedom of contract with employees. There was a complete collapse of sexual mores throughout the Western world all at once, whether it's New Zealand, Australia, Germany, England, America. I mean, this is not due to the Founding Fathers. I can assure you of that. This is something where I want to go back to Josh Mitchell to conclude, and it's his comments about Nietzsche's diagnosis of what's wrong with us. That's where you need to go to understand our current situation. It's a psychological malady that is profoundly, it is a profound indication of a deep dissatisfaction in the Western soul. Now that it has gotten rid of God, it has gotten rid of nature and reason, it has gotten rid of all meaning in human life. It has put us exactly in the situation he said Tocqueville worried about, where we're living in the present moment. That's where we are, and that is not something that the Founding Fathers can be blamed for, and I also agree it's something the Founding Fathers probably can't help us solve. But that's something we're going to have to solve ourselves, and I don't know how to do it either. But thank you very much.
So I think it's a fitting way to conclude. That's all we have time for. Our next session will begin after a short break. Thank you.